I never expected that a leaky pipe would change my life. But that's exactly what happened when the supposedly straight bartender from my local dive needed a place to stay. It started, as most things in my life did back then, with a quiet routine and a healthy dose of observation from a safe distance. My name is Miles. At 26, my world was a neat collection of predictable patterns. I worked from home as a data analyst, which meant my days were a silent conversation between me, my laptop, and endless spreadsheets. The numbers made sense. They were logical, clean, and never said one thing while meaning another. People, on the other hand, were a chaotic variable I preferred to keep at arm's length. My apartment was my sanctuary, a small one-bedroom place on the third floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. It was tidy, sparsely decorated, and quiet. Most nights, the loudest sound was the hum of the refrigerator or the distant siren weaving through the city streets. This solitude was a double-edged sword. It was safe, but it was also profoundly lonely. My one deviation from this sterile routine was the Rusty Mug. It was a proper neighborhood bar, the kind of place with worn-out wooden floors, a lingering smell of stale beer and fried food, and a jukebox that seemed permanently stuck in the 90s. It was dim, unassuming, and best of all, nobody there knew me as anything other than the quiet guy who sat at the far end of the bar 3 nights a week with a book and a beer. It was the perfect place to feel the comforting presence of other people without the exhausting obligation of actually engaging with them. And then there was Caleb. Caleb was the bartender. He was the reason I chose the Rusty Mug over the half-dozen other bars closer to my apartment. From my corner perch, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of him. He moved with an easy, unforced grace, his hands sure and quick as they mixed drinks, wiped down the counter, and took payment. He had dark, unruly hair that he was constantly pushing off his forehead, and a smile that seemed to light up the dingy room. He was, in my carefully curated opinion, the epitome of the effortlessly cool, completely unattainable straight guy. He joked with the construction workers who came in after their shifts. He charmed the groups of women who were celebrating birthdays, and he could talk sports with an encyclopedic knowledge that I found both baffling and impressive. He had a way of making every single person feel like they were the most important customer in the room, including me. He'd always greet me with a nod and a small smile. The usual, Miles? It was a simple question, but the fact that he remembered my name and my drink order sent a ridiculous, disproportionate thrill through me every single time. It was the extent of our interactions, but for me, it was enough. It was a tiny spark of connection in my otherwise insulated world. I would watch him, study the way his forearms flexed when he shook a cocktail shaker, the way he'd bite his lower lip when he was concentrating on counting out change. I built entire narratives around him. He probably had a girlfriend, a pretty one who worked as a nurse or a teacher. They probably lived in a sunny apartment with a dog. On his days off, he probably played in a softball league and went on hikes. He was a complete, finished painting, and I was just someone looking at it through the thick glass of a museum display. Close enough to see, but never, ever close enough to touch. This was the silent agreement I'd made with myself. I could admire, but I couldn't want. Wanting was dangerous. It led to disappointment. So I kept to my routine. I'd go to the bar, sit in my corner, read my book, and nurse my one beer for an hour. I'd watch Caleb exist in his world, a world that felt a million miles away from mine, even though he was only ever 20 feet away. It was a strange kind of comfort, this predictable, one-sided dynamic. It was my secret, a small, harmless flame of a crush I could warm my hands on without any risk of getting burned. Or so I thought. That's how life works sometimes, isn't it? You get comfortable in your carefully constructed reality, and then a leaky pipe comes along and threatens to flood the whole thing. It was a Tuesday night, slower than usual. The rain was coming down in sheets, plastering leaves against the bar's windows and making the whole place feel like a cozy, isolated ship in a storm. I was about to close my tab when Caleb walked over, wiping a glass with a towel. He looked tired, more so than usual. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usual bright energy seemed dimmed. "Hey, Miles," he said, his voice a little strained. "Got a weird question for you." My heart did a little stutter step. A weird question? My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, none of them plausible. Sure. What's up?" I tried to sound casual, as if my entire nervous system wasn't suddenly on high alert. He leaned against the bar, running a hand through his damp hair. It's my apartment. The ceiling in my bathroom decided to turn into a waterfall tonight. The guy who lives above me left his tub running or something. It's a total disaster, he sighed, a heavy, frustrated sound. My landlord is useless, says he can't get a plumber out until Thursday at the earliest. The whole place smells like mildew, and my bedroom floor is soaked. Wow, that's awful, I said, my voice full of genuine sympathy. I couldn't imagine my sanctuary being violated like that. Yeah, it is, he looked at me then, a direct, searching gaze that made me feel completely transparent. Look, I know this is a massive long shot, and totally out of the blue, but you live around here, right? I remember you saying you were just a few blocks away. I nodded, unable to speak. My buddy's place is full, and I really don't want to shell out for a hotel. I was just wondering, and please, feel free to say no, if I could maybe crash on your couch for a couple of nights? Just until they get the mess sorted. I'm quiet. I'm clean. I'll be at work most of the time. You'll barely even know I'm there. The world seemed to stop. Time slowed down, and the only things that existed were his hopeful, anxious eyes and the frantic pounding of my own heart. Caleb, on my couch, in my apartment. The idea was so preposterous, so far outside the realm of possibility I had created, that I almost laughed. This was a crossover event I had never prepared for. My safe, predictable world and the world he inhabited were about to collide. Every cautious, self-protective instinct I had screamed at me to say no. It was too much, too soon, too everything. It would shatter the comfortable distance I had maintained. It would bring him into my space, my real life, not just the curated version that sat at the end of his bar. He would see my boring apartment, my quiet life. He would see me. And what if he didn't like what he saw? But then I looked at him again. I saw the genuine stress in his face, the exhaustion in his posture. He wasn't the confident, untouchable bartender right now. He was just a guy who had a really bad day and needed a little help. And deep down, a traitorous little voice whispered, "This is your chance." A chance for what? I wasn't sure, but it was a chance. Yeah, I heard myself say, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. Yeah, of course. My couch isn't great, but you're welcome to it. The relief that flooded his face was immediate and dazzling. His entire posture seemed to change, the tension draining out of his shoulders. Are you serious? Miles, that's man. Thank you. You're a lifesaver. Seriously, his smile, that brilliant, room-lighting smile, was aimed directly at me, and it felt like staring into the sun. And just like that, the routine was broken. The carefully built wall between my world and his crumbled into dust. Caleb, the bartender from my daydreams, was coming home with me. I had no idea what I was doing, but as I paid my tab and waited for him to finish his shift, a terrifying mix of panic and exhilaration churned in my stomach. The ship was leaving the harbor, and I was officially sailing into uncharted waters. The walk to my apartment was a strange, surreal experience. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the wet pavement reflected the streetlights, making the city look like a blurry watercolor painting. Usually, I walked this route lost in my own thoughts, but now, I was intensely aware of Caleb walking beside me. I was aware of the space between us, of the sound of his footsteps next to mine, of the occasional brush of his jacket against my arm. He was carrying a duffel bag he'd stashed in the back office, and he was quieter now that we were away from the bar. It was a different kind of silence than the one I was used to. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a nervous energy that seemed to crackle between us. I fumbled with my keys at the front door of my building, my fingers suddenly clumsy. "Sorry, it sticks sometimes," I mumbled, finally getting the lock to turn. "No worries," he said, following me into the dimly lit hallway. "Third floor, right? Good for the cardio." He was trying to be light, to ease the awkwardness, and I was grateful for it. When I opened the door to my apartment, I saw it through his eyes for the first time. It suddenly felt too small, too plain, to me. The single bookshelf was organized alphabetically by author. The throw pillows on the couch were perfectly arranged. There was a distinct lack of personality, a void where a life should be. It was the home of someone who analyzed data, not someone who lived with passion. "Here it is," I said, gesturing vaguely. "The grand tour will take about 10 seconds. Living room, kitchen, bathrooms down the hall, bedrooms the door at the end. Make yourself at home." Caleb dropped his bag by the door and looked around. I held my breath, waiting for the judgment, for the flicker of disappointment. But he just smiled. It's nice, man. Clean. My place looks like a tornado hit it on a good day. He walked over to the window and looked out at the rain-slicked street. This is a great view. We spent the next hour in a state of polite, awkward cohabitation. I showed him where the extra blankets and pillows were. He insisted on setting up the couch himself. I made him a cup of tea, and we sat at my small kitchen table, the silence punctuated by the clinking of our spoons against the mugs. The dynamic was completely inverted. In the bar, he was the host, the one in control. Here, in my space, he seemed almost subdued. It was during that first night that I started to see the cracks in the persona I had built for him. The confident, extroverted bartender was replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful man. He asked me about my job, and he actually listened, nodding along as I tried to explain what a data analyst does without making it sound as boring as it often was. He didn't just pretend to be interested. He asked follow-up questions. Then he told me about his day, about the chaos of the leak, the argument with his landlord. His frustration was real and raw. This wasn't a performance. This was just him. A guy with problems, a guy who got tired and stressed out. It was shockingly normal. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, I saw him pull a large, leather-bound sketchbook and a case of pencils from his duffel bag. I tried not to stare, but my curiosity must have been obvious. He noticed me looking and gave a small, almost shy shrug. It's for school. School? I asked, surprised. I thought you were a bartender full-time. I am mostly. To pay the bills, he explained, setting the sketchbook on the coffee table. But I'm also studying architecture. We're trying to. I'm in my last year, but it's taking forever doing it part-time. An architect. The idea was so far from the beer and softball fantasy I had created for him that it completely rewired my perception of him. An architect. It implied creativity, precision, a vision for the future. It was unexpected. Can I? I motioned towards the book, my voice barely a whisper. He hesitated for a second, a flicker of insecurity crossing his face. It was a look I had never seen on him before. Sure, he said finally. It's mostly just sketches and half-baked ideas. Don't judge too harshly. I sat on the armchair across from the couch and carefully opened the book. The pages were filled with the most beautiful, intricate drawings I had ever seen. There were detailed floor plans for houses that seemed to grow out of the landscape, sketches of futuristic public spaces, and stunningly realistic renderings of buildings that looked like they belonged in a museum. His lines were clean and confident. His sense of space and light was incredible. Caleb, these are amazing, I said, my voice filled with genuine awe. You're really talented. He ducked his head, a faint blush creeping up his neck. Thanks. I don't know. I look at them and all I see are the mistakes. And there it was. A moment of pure, unguarded vulnerability. This confident, charming man was insecure about his art, about this thing he was clearly passionate about. It was the most humanizing, most attractive thing I could have possibly discovered. It made him real. It made the distance between us feel infinitesimally smaller. As I turned a page, a concept sketch for a library, our hands brushed against each other over the spine of the book. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental touch that lasted less than a second. But for me, it was like an electric shock. A jolt of warmth shot up my arm, and I instinctively pulled my hand back. But when I glanced up at him, he was already looking at me. He didn't pull away. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and in that shared glance, the air in the room changed. It became heavier, charged with a new and unspoken possibility. It was just a small moment, a tiny flicker in time, but it was enough. It was the moment a fragile, terrifying hope began to take root in my chest. The next 2 days were a masterclass in navigating a space that had become charged with unspoken tension. We fell into a strange domestic rhythm. I'd wake up early to the smell of coffee because Caleb, despite coming home from the bar long after I was asleep, was an early riser. He'd be sitting at my kitchen table, sketchbook open, a look of intense concentration on his face. "Morning," he'd say, his voice a little rough with sleep, and that simple greeting would be enough to make my stomach do a nervous flip. We didn't talk about the moment with the sketchbook. We didn't talk about the way our eyes had met. We talked about everything else. We talked about movies, about the weird neighbors in my building, about his frustrations with a particular professor. The conversations were easy, natural, and far more intimate than any exchange we'd ever had over the bar. I learned that he hated cilantro, that he was terrified of spiders, and that he had a younger sister he was incredibly close to. I learned that the confident bartender was just one facet of a much more complex person. There was Caleb the dedicated student, Caleb the loyal brother, and Caleb the quiet artist. I was becoming fascinated by all of them. He, in turn, was learning about me. He discovered my obsession with old black and white movies, my surprisingly competitive nature when it came to board games, and the fact that I couldn't cook to save my life. One evening, he insisted on making dinner, taking over my tiny kitchen with an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He moved with the same grace I'd seen at the bar, chopping vegetables and sautéing them with a practiced ease. "You know," he said, not looking up from the pan, "for a guy who deals with precise data all day, you're surprisingly chaotic in the kitchen." "Hey, my system of ordering takeout is very precise," I retorted, and he laughed. It was a real, genuine laugh, and the sound of it in my apartment felt like a gift. We ate pasta sitting on the floor in my living room, and it was the best meal I had eaten in years. But underneath all this growing familiarity, the memory of that shared glance, of that brief touch, lingered. It was a constant hum beneath the surface of our interactions. I would catch him looking at me sometimes, with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Was it curiosity? Friendship? Or was it something more? I was too afraid to hope. The fear of rejection was a powerful, paralyzing force. I had built my life around avoiding it. I told myself I was misreading everything. He was just being friendly. He was a naturally charming person, and I was just another recipient of that charm. He was straight. I had to keep reminding myself of that fundamental, unchangeable fact. He was straight, and I was just the nice, quiet guy who had let him crash on his couch. To imagine anything else was to set myself up for a world of hurt. And yet, the hope persisted. It was a stubborn weed, pushing its way through the cracks of my carefully constructed defenses. It was there in the way he'd leave a fresh cup of coffee on my desk in the morning before he left for class. It was there in the way he'd text me a funny meme in the middle of the day. These were small things, tiny gestures, but they felt significant. They felt like he was trying to bridge the gap between us, to build something more than a temporary roommate arrangement. My internal world was a battlefield. Hope and fear were locked in a constant, brutal war. One moment, I'd be convinced there was something real happening between us. The next, I'd be drowning in anxiety, certain that I was just a fool projecting my own desires onto a kind, straight man. It was exhausting. The turning point came on Thursday night. It was supposed to be his last night at my place. His landlord had finally gotten the apartment repaired, and he was planning to move back the next day. The thought of him leaving, of my apartment returning to its sterile silence, left a hollow ache in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. He came home from his shift at the bar well after midnight. I was still up, pretending to read a book on the couch, but really, I was just waiting. I heard his keys in the lock, the soft click of the door closing. He walked into the living room and sank onto the armchair, letting out a long, weary sigh. "Long night?" I asked, putting my book down. He nodded, rubbing his temples. "The longest." We were slammed. And I have a huge midterm for my structural design class tomorrow that I haven't even started studying for. I'm so stressed out my head feels like it's going to explode. He looked utterly defeated, the weight of everything pressing down on him. I saw the deep lines of tension around his eyes and in the set of his shoulders. And without thinking, without allowing my usual cautious nature to intervene, I heard myself speak. The words just came out, a simple, impulsive offer born from a genuine desire to help. "Here," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Come sit on the floor. I can give you a shoulder rub. It might help with the headache." The moment the words were out, a wave of panic washed over me. What had I just done? It was too familiar, too intimate. I had just crossed a line, a big, glaring, obvious line. I braced myself for him to laugh it off, to give me a weird look, to politely decline. But he didn't. He looked at me, his eyes tired but clear. There was a long, silent beat where he just seemed to be studying my face. Then he slowly nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "Yeah, that would be really nice." My heart hammered against my ribs as he moved from the armchair to sit on the rug in front of the couch, his back to me. I hesitated for a second, my mind screaming at me to abort the mission. This was a terrible idea, but he was waiting. So I took a deep breath and knelt on the couch behind him. I placed my hands on his shoulders. His muscles were rock hard, tight with knots of stress. His t-shirt was soft under my fingertips, and I could feel the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton. I started tentatively, my movements clumsy and unsure. But then he let out a soft sigh and leaned his head forward, a silent invitation to continue. So I did. I let go of my fear and focused on the task. I worked my thumbs into the tight muscles of his neck and shoulders, feeling the knots slowly begin to yield under the pressure. The room was completely silent except for the sound of our breathing and the soft whisper of fabric as I moved. The act itself was simple, but the intimacy of it was overwhelming. The professional boundary of bartender and patron, the temporary boundary of roommates, it all dissolved in that moment. I was touching him, willingly, with his permission. I was so close I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with the subtle, unique scent that was just him. My entire world narrowed to the space of my hands on his skin. I have no idea how long it lasted. Time seemed to stretch and warp. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour. All I knew was the rhythm of the movement, the feeling of the tension leaving his body, the quiet sounds of contentment he made. He leaned back slightly, his head resting against my knees, a gesture of such complete and total trust that it made my breath catch in my throat. In that quiet, dimly lit living room, something fundamental shifted between us. It wasn't sexual, not explicitly, but it was one of the most intimate experiences of my life. It was an act of care, of quiet communication that went deeper than words. It was a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had been building between us all week. As my fingers worked magic on his tired muscles, I knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that I had fallen for him. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was falling for me too. The next morning, the atmosphere in the apartment was thick enough to cut with a knife. The easy camaraderie we had built over the last few days was gone, replaced by a stilted, awkward politeness. We moved around each other like strangers, carefully avoiding eye contact, our words clipped and formal. "There's coffee," I said to the kitchen counter, not looking at him. "Thanks," he replied to the refrigerator door. The intimacy of the previous night hung in the air between us, a massive, unspoken thing. I had no idea what it meant. Had I crossed a boundary? Had I made him uncomfortable? Or had he felt it too? That powerful, undeniable connection? My mind, my data-driven, analytical mind, went into overdrive. I spent the entire morning replaying every second of the shoulder rub, searching for clues, for data points I could analyze. I replayed the way he had sighed when I first touched him. Was it a sigh of relief or a sigh of resignation? I replayed the way he had leaned his head back against my knees. Was it a sign of trust or just a comfortable position? Every detail was scrutinized, every possibility weighed. My internal monologue was a relentless cycle of hope and despair. He let you touch him. He trusted you. That has to mean something, right? Don't be an idiot, Miles. Straight guys let their friends do that all the time. It was a friendly gesture. You're reading way too much into it. But the way he looked at you, you're projecting. You're seeing what you want to see. This internal debate was utterly exhausting. I felt raw, exposed, and incredibly vulnerable. I had let him see a part of me, the caring, gentle part, and I had no idea how he had interpreted it. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I was so lost in my own head that I could barely function. I stared at the same spreadsheet for 2 hours, not processing a single number. Caleb left for his midterm mid-morning, and the silence he left behind was deafening. I paced my small apartment, feeling trapped. I wanted to run, to hide, to go back to the way things were before, when he was just the handsome bartender and I was just the quiet customer. Life was so much simpler then, but it was also so much emptier. I couldn't deny that. These last few days, despite the anxiety, I had felt more alive than I had in years. He was supposed to pack his things and move back to his own apartment after his exam. The thought of it was like a punch to the gut. This brief, beautiful interruption to my monotonous life was about to end. He would go back to his world, and I would go back to mine. We'd see each other at the bar, and he'd say, "The usual, Miles," and we would both pretend that these few days had never happened. The thought was unbearable. I spent the afternoon in a state of quiet misery, convinced that I had ruined everything. I had taken a simple act of kindness, him needing a place to stay, and burdened it with all of my own complicated feelings. He was probably dreading coming back to get his bag, trying to figure out how to let me down gently. I braced myself for the inevitable, for the friendly but firm, "Thanks for everything, man," that would put me squarely back in the friend zone, or worse, the weird customer once stayed with zone. When I heard his keys in the door late that afternoon, my heart leaped into my throat. This was it, the end of the line. I stood up from my desk, my palms sweating, and walked into the living room to face the music. He was standing by the door, his duffel bag at his feet. But he wasn't packing. He was just standing there, looking at me with that same unreadable expression from the night before. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy with everything that had been left unsaid. Finally, he broke it. His voice was quiet, but it seemed to echo in the small room. "Miles," he said, "I think we need to talk." My stomach plummeted. "We need to talk" are the four most terrifying words in the English language. They are the prologue to every breakup, every difficult conversation, every moment of rejection. I braced myself, my defenses on full alert, ready for the impact. "Okay," I managed to say, my own voice sounding thin and weak. Caleb took a deep breath, and it seemed to take all of his courage. He finally met my gaze, and his eyes were full of a nervous vulnerability that mirrored my own. "First of all," he began, "I have a confession to make." Here it comes, I thought. He's going to tell me he has a girlfriend, and he feels guilty. "The leak in my apartment," he said, his words coming out in a rush. There was a leak, but it wasn't that bad. My landlord had it fixed the next morning. On Wednesday, I just stared at him, my mind trying to process this new information. He could have left 2 days ago. I don't understand," I stammered. "Why did you stay?" He took a step closer, closing the distance between us. "Because I didn't want to leave," he said, his voice dropping to an earnest whisper. "Because being here with you, it's been the best part of my year." The world tilted on its axis. My carefully constructed theories, my anxious predictions, all of them shattered into a million pieces. "Miles, he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I was coming to recognize as a nervous habit. "Look, I'm not good at this, but I have to tell you. I first noticed you at the bar months ago. The quiet guy in the corner with the book. There was just something about you. I wanted to talk to you, really talk to you, but I never had the nerve. I had no idea if you were, interested. And I was terrified of being wrong, of making you uncomfortable and having you never come back." He took another step. We were so close now I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "So when my pipe leaked, I saw it as an excuse. A crazy, stupid excuse to try and get to know you. And these past few days, they've been better than I could have imagined. You're not just the quiet guy with the book. You're funny and smart and kind. So incredibly kind." He gestured back towards the couch, a silent reference to the night before. "And last night, when you did that, it wasn't weird. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was everything. It was the confirmation I needed that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one feeling this." I was speechless. My mind, usually a raging torrent of anxiety and doubt, was completely silent. There was only the sound of his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, and the thunderous beating of my own heart, which felt like it was trying to escape my chest. All the fear, all the uncertainty that had been plaguing me, it all just evaporated, replaced by a feeling of overwhelming, dizzying relief. I thought you were straight," I finally whispered, the words I had clung to like a shield for so long. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I thought so too for a long time. Or maybe I was just trying to be. But then I saw you, and you made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. The truth is, I don't really care about the labels. I just know that I'm interested in you." That was all it took. The dam inside me broke. "I'm interested in you too," I said, the confession feeling like a release of a lifetime of pent-up hope. "Caleb, I have been for so long." A brilliant, beautiful smile spread across his face, the one I had admired from afar for months. But this time, it was just for me. And then he did what I had only ever allowed myself to do in my wildest dreams. He closed the last inch of space between us, cupped my face in his warm hands, and kissed me. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of confirmation, of relief, of mutual understanding. It was confident and sure, and it tasted faintly of coffee and mint and the beginning of everything. In that moment, all the noise in my head went silent, and for the first time in a very long time, everything made perfect sense. In the weeks that followed, my life transformed. The quiet, gray predictability I had mistaken for safety was replaced by vibrant color and happy, wonderful chaos. Caleb never did move back to his apartment. His duffel bag by the door was soon joined by a box of books, then a suitcase of clothes, and then, piece by piece, his life merged with mine. My small, quiet apartment was no longer just a sanctuary. It became a home, filled with laughter, the smell of his cooking, and the soft scratching of his pencil in his sketchbook late at night. We fell into a new routine, one built for two. We went on dates, real dates. We walked through museums, had picnics in the park, and saw old black and white movies at the Revival Theater downtown. He introduced me to his friends, who were loud and welcoming and treated me like I had always been part of the group. I, in turn, slowly learned to let my guard down, to step out from behind my book and engage with the world. Caleb had a way of making me feel safe enough to be brave. I loved watching him work on his architecture projects. He would spread his plans out over the living room floor, and I would lie on my stomach beside him, listening as he passionately explained the principles of structural integrity or the importance of natural light. I was his sounding board, his cheerleader, and his late-night coffee provider during finals week. Seeing that hidden, vulnerable part of him, the artist and the dreamer, made me fall in love with him a little more each day. He loved the quiet parts of me. He loved my ridiculous organizational systems, my encyclopedic knowledge of film trivia, and the way I would get completely lost in a spreadsheet. He never tried to change me. He just made space for me to be myself, fully and completely. He taught me that vulnerability wasn't a weakness, but a bridge that connects two people. A few months after that first kiss, Caleb put in his 2 weeks' notice at the Rusty Mug. He had landed a paid internship at a prestigious architecture firm, the final step before his graduation. It was the beginning of his dream, and I couldn't have been prouder. On his last night, I went to the bar to see him off. But instead of sitting in my usual corner, I stood behind the bar with him after closing time. The room was empty and quiet, a stark contrast to the noisy, crowded space I was used to. It felt like a sacred, private space, just for us. He poured 2 glasses of the good whiskey he kept on the top shelf. "To new beginnings," he said, clinking his glass against mine. We stood there in comfortable silence for a while, just sipping our drinks and looking around the place where it had all started. It was strange to be on this side of the bar, looking out at the empty stools. I pointed to the one at the far end. "That was my spot," I said, a soft smile on my face. He followed my gaze, and his expression softened. "I know," he said. He put his glass down on the counter and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. The simple gesture was so familiar now, so comforting. I spent more time watching that stool than all the others combined. He pulled me closer and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss right there behind the bar. It was a perfect, full-circle moment. The distance that had once seemed so vast and insurmountable between the bartender and the quiet customer was gone. There was no distance at all. As we walked home that night, hand in hand under the city lights, I thought about how much can change from one small decision. The old me, the cautious, fearful me, would have said no that rainy Tuesday night. He would have protected his quiet routine at all costs and missed out on the greatest adventure of his life. Life is rarely about the grand, dramatic gestures. More often, it's about the small moments of courage, the quiet leaps of faith. It's about offering a stranger a place to stay, massaging the shoulders of a tired friend, or confessing your feelings even when you're terrified. You just never know when one simple yes can rewrite your entire story. For me, saying yes to Caleb was the best data point I ever analyzed, leading to a conclusion more beautiful than I could have ever predicted. It was the best decision I ever made.